right. Hello again, everyone. So this brings us to the final session of this 2023 Green Coffee Summit. And we're going to end with a presentation that speaks to one of the most frequently asked questions that we get about the coffee value assessment. And that is, how can this be used in contracts? So Sarian Barry is going to shed light on the usefulness of the coffee value assessment to a trader working with a variety of different clients whose coffee specifications and communication styles vary pretty widely. So Sarian is a global quality assurance manager at Triboca, a green specialty coffee importer. Her team is responsible for all coffee analyses, and she also manages certifications and Triboca's sustainability efforts. So welcome, Sarian.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to be here. Yeah, thank you for having me. And yeah, excited to start.
Yeah, our pleasure. Let's see if we can get your slides pulled up. All right, here we are.
Perfect. Well, let me then jump right off and start with thanking everybody for being here today and listening to me and closing off. That's a special treat. Discussing the CVA in the coffee trading industry. First, a little bit more about myself. I've been working in coffee since 2005, so it's been a while. And started as a barista, but now I work as the global quality manager at Triboca. And we're a trading company based in the Netherlands. We're specialized in Ethiopian coffees and certified coffees. We have a small team around the world of 30 people. Of which 7 work in the quality department. And our main responsibilities are food safety, food and sustainability regulations, certification standards, as well as the evaluation of green coffee beans, of course. So the green grading, any classifications, sensory evaluation. So that's really what we do as a quality team. And today I'm here to give more of a practical insight into the CVA, or the coffee value assessment that the SCA developed, and how a trading company such as ourselves can use this sensory evaluation in our business, and how we use a sensory profile, where a profile, of course, and a flavor is so personal. How do we use those evaluations? There will also be a Menti poll in this presentation, just to give you a heads up to get your phones ready or your extra tab in your browser ready for a poll. So that we'll have that definitely ready to go. So talking about why sensory evaluation is so important for a trading company. We really see ourselves as a trading company as a bridge or a facilitator, right? We work with roasters all over the world. We work with producers all over the world. And what we do is we bridge that, and we try to facilitate transport, of course, and sales. But a large part of what we do is insurance. We try to link the roaster to the right producer and the other way around, and to get everyone the product that they need at the quality that they need it. So for us, it's super important to be able to filter not on extrinsic needs only, like what origin, what price, of course, is essential. If there's a certification linked, if it needs to adhere to certain regulation. For example, if we're working with a roaster in Korea, might have a completely different set of regulations required than to the EU or to the US. So meeting that, processing specific moisture requirements, etc. But a large part is also, of course, to find the coffee that sensorically fits with what the roaster is looking for, and the expectation that they have, and the need that they're trying to fill in the roastery or their cafe. So that means that sensory analysis is a very large part of every coffee that we buy. We do sensory analysis throughout the chain of the delivery. So usually we start with tasting samples from the farm before they're processed. So we get them in stock lots in our offices in Ethiopia. And then those are evaluated. We get the first profile sketch And then we also always taste it as a pre-shipment, and we often taste it on arrival as well, especially if it's long position, but also if it goes then directly to a customer, we test the arrival as well. And the reason that we do this is that we don't just want to find the right coffee for the roaster, but we want to make sure that we actually deliver what we promise. So also sensory analysis over time and comparing the evaluation throughout the supply chain is very important to us. Currently, what we do is we use an updated version of the SCA form, or the form that you also know from Q grading, for example. As you see here, it's similar to the SCA form. It has the 6 to 10, but you do see, of course, that we've customized the form slightly already, moving it actually a little bit closer to the CVA form as it currently stands. And that is because we wanted to see the intensity levels. We added some general notes, which we did about 5 years ago, because we really missed that already in our process. And I'll explain a little bit more why that is. But generally speaking, as you can see, it's the 6 to 10, making it very specialty coffee focused. And that results in a score from, well, let's say for specialty 80 to 100. And then there's one section for notes on how the coffee tastes. Everything that we then cup, we digitalize. So we put it in our sample database where we store the scores. We put the scores per attribute. We have a note section. So everything that we write in the note section that you see here goes into the sample database. And then we note, of course, any uniformity or defect issues. And this database is then used to find the correct coffee for the customer, provide feedback to the supplier, of course, the producer, which is also essential, but also check how the coffee changes over time. So that's what we currently use. Now, why is that perhaps not enough, and why are we moving towards this CVA internally? We have this system. We're implementing the CVA mostly because we see the added value. As you saw in the last slide, we already updated a few years ago our assessment to include more descriptive aspects and intensity levels, because we found that it's easier to communicate to the supplier and the producer and the customer, the roaster, but it's also easier to filter on profile and see the changes over time. The benefits of the form is that it's not just specialty focused. It can also work with more commercial grades, and even Cascara really is something that we've been trying to do on the form as well. And that is some of the business that we do as well. So having room to really be able to evaluate those types of grades has been really, really useful for us. But more than that, it really helps us find the correct coffee. To give an example, the roaster might come to us and they communicate with us what they want. So they might say, I want an Ethiopian coffee. It needs to be fair trade and organic. I have a specific price wish. It needs to be a specific grade, so grade 1, grade 2, and I want a natural process. And it needs to score 86 plus. Well, then we find those extrinsic matches, and we find the producer for the region, the grade, of course, the supplier that offers these certifications. And then we start to look to, okay, so 86, great. And that can sometimes end up on the contract. Often you hear trade is based on scores, and often it isn't. Sometimes, yes, we have contracts with scores on them, but often we don't. And the reason for that is 86. What does that mean if you have that on the contract and you have, even if it's not on a contract, but just communicated, a roaster saying, I want an 86 coffee. or Triboca saying that to a supplier, the coffee needs to score 86. What expectation are you really trying to meet when you hear that score? What is an 86 scoring coffee? What is an 86 for us? What's an 86 for the roaster? What's an 86 for the supplier who's offering the sample? That might be really different. I've been in cupping rooms where, the scores differ from 82 to 90, specifically more so for coffees that are more controversial, so that are super boozy or are anaerobically processed. But even just for washed coffees, sometimes you see these huge gaps. Additionally, you also have the question, what is the customer expectation when they say, I want an Ethiopian coffee, which needs to score 86? What does that even mean? And how does that work? Like, what are we actually going to offer this roaster? So yes, contracts sometimes include an SCA score, but many don't. And the reason for that as well is that the coffee industry is a sample-based business. Most contracts in the end, even if they include a score, will always say, we'll buy this batch or we'll buy this volume from you pending sample approval, which means you need to send a sample, and that sample then finalizes the okay of the contract. Sending samples costs a lot of time, a lot of custom duties. It costs a lot of money in general. And sending samples can also delay a shipment or an approval of a contract as well. Specifically, if you don't send the sample that matches the need, right? So if you have one contract and you need to send not one sample for approval, but you need to send 2, 3, 5, 10, it gets very, very expensive very quickly. And additionally, you're asking someone to cup all of these, roast all of these, evaluate all of these. And you don't really want to waste people's time. You want to give them the coffee that they want quickly, and be efficient. So you always want to send a sample that fits. That's what you're really looking for. And that brings us to the first question. And I think you should have a link to the Menti in the comments, as well as the Menti code. And the question is, what profile would you choose if a roaster would come to you based on the following description? Natural Ethiopia 86 plus. That's what we have. Then we have 3 profiles. These are the coffees that we tasted. One was medium sweet in acidity, thin, silky in body, and the flavor notes were cherry, winey, and vanilla. The second, medium lemon acidity, medium body, notes of cardamom, lime, and hibiscus. And the third was high lemon acidity, full body, tropical fruit, stone fruit, and brown spice. So the question is, for you, based on these descriptions, which one for you would be like, yes, that is what I would pick if I'm looking for a natural Ethiopia 86 plus? And then we'll give you some time to score, choose, and see what you think you would choose. And this is something really that we do as a trading company on a daily basis. This is what our team does. Someone comes in, says, this is what I want. We go through our system and say, this might be a good match. First ones are in. Oof, 30, 30, 30. Well, it seemed like the first one was going to win, but now it's changing again. I think what you see here already, well, we'll still see some votes coming in. It's not that easy. And opinions do differ. And then what do you do? Do you send all three? Do you send one? What do you do? And that's really where we run into those questions. As Trabuca, we sell coffee across the globe. And we see that preferences differ as well, not just within regions, but within people. And the problem is we would love to calibrate with everybody, but we simply can't. That's just an impossible question to do. There's too many people, and if we calibrate to the one, we calibrate against the other. So we cannot calibrate with everybody, right? So what we need is descriptive agreements and good communication on what a roaster needs and what are they looking for. Are they looking for winey? Are they looking for tropical fruit? Do they want high acidity? Do they want low acidity? That's what we need to know. And whether that is put into a contract or sometimes it's put into a product specification that we receive, or it's just a customer profile where they just say, hey, in my email, normally this is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for, it needs to be natural. It needs to be Ethiopia. It needs to be this price. It needs to be certified to some extent, but I want this type of acidity, this type of flavor profile. And that way we really know what their expectations are and we can make a much more educated assessment of their needs and find the right sample for them. So going to this overview, in the middle you see all the things we already discussed, right? We have organic fair trade, Ethiopia, certain price point, grade needs to be natural. The grade is mentioned like grade 1, 2, 3, it's there. It needs to be around 86 plus, but additionally, we get a flavor profile. We have, it needs to be a medium sweet acidity. We want a medium body. It needs to have some florals. If we're talking about a scale up to 5, it needs to be 4 out of 5 floral. And we want it to be clean. It's a natural, but we want it to be clean, not boozy, not alcoholic. That's not what we want. So with this profile, we can do much, much more. And sometimes, as I said, this goes into the contract. Sometimes it's just a product specification where we hear from our customers, hey, this is what we're looking for. This is what we'll assess the coffee for. This is what goes into the blend. That's the blend component that we're looking for. If we don't receive that, sometimes we receive samples of their coffees. And then we do our own assessment of those coffees and say, okay, so this is the profile. This is how we classify it. And we make that profile for them and we store that. So that also happens sometimes. And what is great going back to the CVA is that this form allows much more to create these types of profiles. As you see, every attribute has an intensity level, which is very, very helpful. And it's very easy to filter in that sense. There's a note field for every attribute. There's descriptors for every attribute. And you can really categorize it into main categories, whether that is just intensity level, low, medium, high, or if that's a specific flavor profile or a main taste. We can really see what this coffee is and create a real profile. What is the acidity of this coffee like? What is the general flavor profile like? What's the sweetness like? What's the mouthfeel like? We can really see per attribute what is going on and how this coffee is experienced. Is this form perfect? No, of course it isn't. And I don't think it necessarily has to be. For example, you're limited to the boxes that you see. for us as Traboka, because we work with mostly Ethiopian coffees, for us it would be very useful to have a fruit box that says stone fruit, or black tea, or bergamot. These are flavors that we use a lot, so it would be useful for us to have that box. But as I showed you, usually we already adjusted the old SCA form to be a little bit more to what we need, and that's what we're planning to do with this form as well. Like if we need a box, if we don't need a box in our system, we can change that. But this structure has really helped us think about how do we create a database and how do we ensure that we have a system and an attribute and a note on every attribute that we can filter on and make it easier to find the coffee that we need. And additionally, it's really nice to have this general flavor profile as well. And it's clear as to what flavors that we find in which general category they live by how the form is created. So that has been really useful. Going back to the same question, showing you why it is useful, going back to the Menti, what profile would you choose based on the following description? The roaster ones: medium sweet acidity, medium body, florals 4 out of 5, needs to be clean, not boozy. Descriptors are the same. Sample 1, medium sweet acidity, thin silky body, cherry, winey, vanilla. The second, medium lemon acidity, medium body, cardamom, lime, and hibiscus. And the third, high lemon acidity, full body, tropical fruit, stone fruit, and brown spice. If you're looking to meet this need, what would you choose? Maybe a few more will still come in, but we already see quite a difference from the last poll, where the second option was not as popular. Now it's getting up there. Still a few options for coffee sample number 1. But we see a clear change here, which is great. Because indeed, this is what you would expect, right? They're looking for medium acidity, which this sample is, medium body, which this coffee is, and then they want florals, and we have hibiscus, and then cardamom, although it's a spice, is a very floral spice. So it makes a lot of sense to send sample number 2 and see if that is what they're looking for. Additionally, the other 2 might fall off the scale. I see 3 indeed falls, right? It has 1 vote, but it has a high lemon acidity, full body, so that's already 2 no's. And then there's no florals in the descriptors, so that's just a hard no. The first one, it does have a sweet acidity, so it might be interesting. It's more thin, silky than medium, but sometimes with roast, you can help the acidity, the body along, right? No florals necessarily in the descriptors, and additionally, it's winey. And then that brings us a little bit to calibration on words and descriptors as well. As you can see, yes, sample 2, that would be the one that I choose to send, and where we have the highest chance of matching what the roaster needs. But some might still classify the first one as a good match based on the acidity and the description of silky in the body. And it doesn't really match for me because it says winey. And within Traboka, winey is often also used for more boozy coffees. And it kind of depends if you classify winey as a descriptor as boozy, yes or no. If you would send this, if you would take the risk and see if the customer feels the same, that winey is already boozy or not. And that's, I think, also why there's a lot of strength in the CVA form, because you have these general profiles where you can say, okay, I think this is winey, but then in what boxes am I putting this? Is that going to be fruity, or am I going to put it into the box of fermenty? or alcoholic. And then if we go back to the presentation, not everybody is calibrated on scoring, of course, which we all know, but also not everybody is calibrated on descriptors. And that goes to the next slide. Yes. Calibration on descriptors is also really important. If I look at these two descriptors, kefir, lime, mango, guava, and the other one, bergamot, stone fruit, and guava, these are descriptors that I took from a coffee that we evaluated. It's the same coffee, just a different panel member within one sensory panel team. And what's great about the open fields is that it gives room for personal flavor preferences, using your own flavor memory to fill in what this coffee tastes like, which is super, super valuable. And especially as a trading company that sells coffee from all over to roasters all over the world, it can be very, very useful to use different references for the same thing, because my palate and my memory is different as a European to a palate of someone living in Asia or in the US or in Africa. So having different references can be super, super useful. The problem is, if I'm looking at how the coffee changes from stock lot from the farm to the pre-shipment to the arrival, as it ages, as it's in the warehouse, and my notes say bergamot, stone fruit, and guava, and then the next time we're cupping it, it's going to say kefir, lime, mango, and guava. The question is, okay, is this a match, yes or no? And then that becomes a little bit hard. I want to be able to go on vacation sometimes, and my team members the same. So we need to agree and understand and calibrate on these descriptors to make the evaluation over time and the comparison between the different times easier. So really you want to have both, right? You want to have the open fields where you can really describe the coffee as you experience it and see if you can use those words to communicate to a roaster, to a supplier, what you experienced. But you also want to know if you mean the same thing within your panel. And I know, because we talked about this and we used the form and we talked about, okay, so we have these notes, in what general profile would you put it? I know that kefir, lime, and bergamot mean the same thing. We're expressing the same flavor and just giving it a different note. So what note do you choose, or how do you really work on that? And having that form there and having those general boxes there really ensures that you can make it easier as well to calibrate on what you're experiencing, and opening up that avenue of discussion to say, is this the same thing that we're tasting, but putting a different word on? Are the flavors close together, or are they far apart? And that's, I think, also why so many cupping rooms have this flavor wheel on the wall. If you look at it, you can see some flavors are very close together and others are further apart. And that all goes back right to the funnel, to the center of the flavor wheel, to the wheel, and to see what general profile are we talking about. So if I hear this fruit and I'm giving that fruit, are we still in the same category, or are you somewhere else? If I'm evaluating this coffee on arrival, is it within the same category, or is it a completely different category compared to the pre-shipment that we received? And it's been really, really good to use these more generic profiles to make that assessment easier. And that doesn't mean that a score isn't useful, right? And so the CVA still has the ability and does offer the room to give the coffee a score from 0 to 100. And we will at Triboca also continue to do that, because also that is super useful. And it gives us a very generic profile, or not a profile, a very generic filter, whether the coffee is not very good, it's okay, it's good, or oh my God, this is an amazing coffee. And we do know when someone comes to us and say, okay, I want an amazing coffee, it's not going to be a coffee that I score a meh, right? So it's not going to be the little meh face in the middle saying, it's not good, it's not bad, it's fine. And I need to be more on the very happy face side. And that's what is also really, really useful. But as you already saw on the poll as well, you need to have some streamlined descriptors, and you need to have some intensity levels to be able to bridge the gap that we all have in personal preferences and flavor profiles. And I think the CVA has definitely helped us at Triboca to think how we can best address this and build this into our sample management system. And that's the practical side of the CVA form that I wanted to share with you today. So I already want to thank you for listening and filling in the poll. And yeah, that's my part. Ready for the questions.
Thank you so much. That was great. I saw a lot of appreciation, especially for how you broke down the, the example of the customer giving guidance and how you try to meet that expectation that they have. That's a real challenge from your, business life. And it's something that, many cuppers can think about or imagine in the more abstract sense about, like naming descriptors. I think there's sometimes the desire to get things right, which I totally understand. People want to get it right, but this really helped to sort of see how a few descriptors can make it a lot more clear what the right answer is for that customer. And to your point, make your investment in the cost of the sample more likely to result in a sale, which is also, that's the point.
As a trader, that's what you want, right? And as a producer as well. And you don't want to waste anybody's time with samples that are just costing them a lot of time to assess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I had a question that's sort of related to that, which is about this idea of calibration or alignment within a supply chain, because that's something that I have, I've been asked about and talked about a lot over the course of the past year in particular, thinking about where is it really practical to get people, thinking along the same lines when it comes to scoring. And you gave an example of, calibrating around descriptors with some of your fellow cuppers. But I wonder, how common is it in your experience to have really good alignment all the way along a supply chain? So your suppliers from Triboca, also your customers. Is that sort of a realistic thing to try to get people to invest more time and energy in?
I think so. It depends on what level you are trying to do it, right? If you're talking about very specific, very high level, very detailed flavor descriptors, it's always going to be more difficult, unless it's super obvious, like it's cinnamon, right?
Yeah.
I mean, everybody in the world knows cinnamon and they can that's it. Whereas if you're going very more specific, and even if you're not going that specific to certain fruit types, like a mango here in the Netherlands is just going to taste completely different than anywhere where it actually grows in the gardens where you live. So that will always be harder to calibrate on, but you can calibrate on, this is like soft tropical fruit. Everybody sort of agrees with that. Or if you say, okay, it's an obvious one is, of course, chocolate, dark chocolate, milk chocolate. Like there's certain categories where you can say, okay. And I think that's also where the CVA form helps with the boxes, the kata boxes, and only marking what applies. It also helps you to think about, okay, I taste this array of flavor, but what's the essential profile? And I do see that is something that you can calibrate on, where you say, okay, choose 3, which are the top 3, choose 5, which are the top 5. And if they are giving something specific, okay, so what if I go one step down in the flavor profile, or in the flavor wheel, what category are we talking about? And then you usually find that you're not that far apart.
Mm-hmm. And then what about scoring? Because I imagine that you know that you have certain customers that score higher and certain customers that score lower, not just your customers. We know this about cuppers generally. Some people just score higher and some people score lower. Is that something where you imagine it might make sense for even some of your suppliers to start to sort of recognize those differences in scoring ranges of different cuppers? Or do you not really see that as important for your suppliers to know?
I think it is probably important. We, as a trading company in Europe, where we import coffees from all over the world, we're spoiled, right? We get to taste all these very different coffees, and it's much easier for us to put a coffee on a scale from 0 to 100. I've also worked with suppliers in different origins where all they taste is their own origin. Right. And naturally, that makes sense. You change your calibration. So where for me, it will all be scoring. Everything that they sent me is scoring 84 to 86, and there's not really much going on there. They're saying, yeah, but no, this is like 81 to 87. Like, nah, it's not.
Yeah.
And that makes sense because that's the experience that they have. So having the ability to see how those scores work, but also really thinking about, okay, they're looking for something that's really, really nice, is much easier to communicate. Okay, I'll send my really, really nice coffee rather than, yeah, here's a score. Doesn't always translate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that example that you gave of, an 81 to 87 range when you're tasting, like when those are the coffees that you're tasting, then confining them to a narrow band doesn't necessarily make any sense unless you know that that's the particular score that the buyer is going to give it. And in that case, it's really good to know what they would assign an 84 and what they would assign an 86. And if they would assign one of your coffees an 87, so much the better.
Exactly. So you can really say, hey, we're scoring this coffee around 84, and this is the descriptor that meets for us that profile score. Yeah. And that really makes it easier to link those two together.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a question from Greg asking, from a practical standpoint, will you ask customers to share this information? I presume that's like information about the profile, more descriptive profile they're looking for. Or will you ask customers to fill out assessments when they request samples?
We're nowhere near asking customers to fill in an assessment. I don't think, it's what the customer wants to share. That's what we work with. But we do generally ask, even if it's just in an email, like, hey, what are you looking for? And the more specific a roaster can be, the better we can help them. And if it's a bit more vague, we'll send more samples. I mean, I say it's expensive and, ideally we want to send you one that fits. But if it's like, we're just looking for something nice, because that also happens, right? Some roasters might not have a very specific profile in mind, or just saying, oh, I want something new, something different this season. Send me something that's nice. Of course, that will remain possible. So it's, it's a service industry in that sense.
Yeah. I think one of the things that you brought up when you and I were talking about this, presentation a few weeks ago was how the, if I got this right, like the sales team that you work with, how they use the descriptive profile. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I think that, for people who are not in the importing business, that like some of the ways in which the cuppers work with the sales team to actually get the coffee to the roasters. It would be interesting to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so our sales team, they often join our panel as well, and they cup the coffees as well, so that they get a bit of an idea of what the coffee tastes like. But in general, what they do is they use, because we get so many samples, we get like over 4,000 samples a year. So memorizing all of those is never going to happen. So what you do is we have a sample database, and everything is in the sample database. And what the sales team does is, okay, I have a customer who says, I'm looking for this specific note, or they're saying, I'm looking for a classic Brazil, or I'm looking for, like, there gives certain input of what they're looking for. And then it's just looking through the sample database of coffees that are still available and what then comes closest to what they describe. And then maybe throw in one or two that are borderline where you're like, but maybe that might be good too. So that is really how they work. And that's exactly why being able to filter more specifically becomes so interesting. Because if it's just one big amount of text, and sometimes, especially if you're cupping with the SCA form, the older version, there's one field. So some cuppers, they write whole essays of what the coffee tastes like, and others write nothing really, maybe one like nice or good coffee or balanced, and that's it. And that's what you're working with. So what we always ensure is that we always write the intensities. We write a few notes so that we know, okay, this is something that we can filter on and make it easy for trade to find the sample that they're looking for.
Yeah, so I can imagine that, like with that example of the person requesting the kind of classic Brazil, that as opposed to the salesperson who, maybe doesn't have a lot of experience cupping Brazilian coffees, would go through the entire database of all the Brazilian coffees to be able to filter for, like, okay, which ones are nutty, or which ones exactly. And then at least narrow it down so that it's that you're focusing on those and not,
yep.
Or
it goes to quality, right? Like, it goes to us and say, okay, we're looking for a classic Brazil. What should I offer them?
Mm-hmm.
But of course, if it's a bit broader, you try to get there together. Yeah.
I have another follow-up question from Greg. I'm so glad that this got asked, because this is another one that I've been asked, and I really know my experience, but not the experience of others, is does using this approach, parentheses, CVA/descriptive cupping, slow you down at all? Or is it pretty similar to what you and your team were doing before with the conventional or old cupping form?
Yeah, so I think in one sense, as I showed, a lot of the form, we already changed a little bit, and we added more intensity levels to the form that we used. It is different. So it's not a form that we are just jumping onto and say, okay, let's go. This is a new form. We'll start tomorrow. Because you do need to get used to it. You do need to calibrate, take your time. Nothing has to happen tomorrow. So what we've really been doing is just practicing and getting to understand the form, seeing how it's different. And then, of course, most of us have been cuppers for such a long time. We've cupped a lot of coffee, so we fill in the form. The first few times we filled in the form, we calculated the score, and we're like, oh, no, no, that doesn't make sense. So you need to recalibrate yourself to a new form, which is normal, right? Every change takes time. I have noticed now that, the more you use it, the easier it becomes. And the more quickly you flow through the form. I also think, and that's more of a company specific, that everybody for themselves will need to think about. If they don't like a certain layout, change it, right? Yeah. It's just a form. And if you want to move a box, if you want to, right now, I think the evaluation form, it's 1 coffee per A4. If you're doing that on paper and not a digital app, that's a lot of paper to manage. Is how can you put 3 on a form? Like, think about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that brought me to another question that I wanted to ask you about, because another thing that comes up frequently in conversations about the coffee value assessment is, from people who have gotten training on cupping. Usually people get training using the SCA form from 2004, maybe the Cup of Excellence form. But in practice, I know that there are dozens, hundreds, I don't know how many derivative forms, sort of adaptations that companies make to suit their needs. do you see a lot of customers developing their own forms? And, does that proliferation of forms change what you do in trying to find coffee to meet their needs?
I do see a lot of customers creating their own evaluation, and sometimes it's a form, sometimes it's very minimal. Especially the larger companies that we work with have their very own specific way of evaluating coffees. It doesn't really change what we do, because if we're just looking at, okay, we have an N score, so we kind of know where this coffee falls in a scale from 0 to 100 of coffee. And we have intensity levels on the attributes, because we don't really see any other attributes that people use. Sometimes they might use bitter as an attribute. That's the only one that I sometimes see additional to what's on the CVA or the old SCA form. Normally, it's always acidity, it's flavor, body, and sometimes it's sweetness. So it's always the same attributes, just in a different format, sometimes in a different scale. But if it's like, for example, the one we had today, floral 4 to 5, that's not on the SCA form, that's not on the CVA form. But we do have boxes for floral, and floral, if that comes back as a descriptor and it's a strong descriptor, or if it's in the general profile, yes, that's the main profile, send it. We don't really need to evaluate the coffee floral scale of 1 to 5. Where is it? Is not something we've seen as being necessary.
Yeah, like that level of detail isn't necessarily something that translates. I also wanted to follow up on what you said about the paper form versus the digital form. Like, it is. It's a lot of paper.
It's a lot of paper.
And I wondered, because you mentioned that you all have a database at Traboka that you built. And I wonder, what you see also, just sort of your perception, not speaking for all the traders out there, on the kind of digital transition or the digitalization of cupping data in your coffee suppliers. To what degree are different producer organizations and exporters also using, databases, either yours or, and how much cupping is happening on paper forms among your suppliers?
Good question. I don't know. We do get, it depends a bit on the supply chain. They don't use ours. That's like the easy answer to give.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes we do get analyses reports that includes score, and sometimes that would include descriptors as well. So we do see that they use usually an SCA type of form to evaluate the coffees. So we do see that. What I've seen when visiting is that it's mostly paper-based.
Yeah, that had been my assumption, but the pace of technology and how things are changing, I also wouldn't have been surprised if there had been a lot of advancement, and I'm sure in some places that's probably the case in the few years since I've been, paying as close attention as I used to.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if it changes within the next few years to be more digital, but currently there's still quite some paperwork. Yeah.
I had a question here that is kind of specific to Traboka. I think someone's just interested in learning a little bit more about your business model. So Tom asked, do you fill demand alone, or does Traboka also promote beans, and then in parentheses, profiles to roasters?
Depending on what you mean, I'm trying to interpret the question. We only sell traceable coffee, so we don't blend anything ourselves. So it's not like we say, hey, this is a specific flavor profile that you can buy from us. That being said, of course, we work with some suppliers that have a very steady flavor profile that every year tastes the same. So if it's like, yes, that's the flavor profile that I like, we can be like, great, we have someone who can deliver that every single year. So in that sense, yes, right? Because we're selling this Ethiopian coffee that always tastes stone fruit, florals, and orange. And it's the same every year, and that's how we sell it. But we don't create flavor profiles and then find coffees to meet that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's sort of related to what's probably going to be our last question. Camila asks, do you share profile/flavor requests, presumably that you get from your customers, with your suppliers, or do you just receive samples and see which of those you can use for each specific requirement? So
that also depends.
Yeah.
So we have suppliers that we work with for 20 years. So it's a supply chain that we also actively promote towards roasters, because we believe in the quality that these suppliers deliver. And then it's, in that sense, yes, that's just something that we sell and that's there. And sometimes if we have a customer who has a specific profile that we don't see or that we're going to have to actively search for, yes, we share with the suppliers, hey, this is what we're looking for. We haven't seen that around. Is that something you can offer? So it depends a little bit, but and it depends, of course, on the roaster. Some roasters are very careful and say, no, this is really like our information that you cannot share. So then we cannot share it, at least not as they are sharing it.
Yeah.
So that depends a little bit. So if we get a product specification, we might not share that product specification, but we'll share like, hey, this is what we're looking for.
Yeah.
Is that what you can offer this year?
Yeah.
Some suppliers send us samples and then we always buy it and we find the roaster for them.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we actively ask for specific profiles from suppliers. Both happen.
Yeah. That's really interesting and brought up something that I hadn't thought much about, which is that roasters might not want to be associated with a particular profile. I mean, to me, that feels like it'd be great, like easier, the more people know, the better they're going to be able to fulfill your, or meet your expectations. But
product
something to think about.
Be private.
Yeah, sure. Well, Sarian, thank you so much for joining us today. That was a really interesting presentation, super practical. I think people will have learned a lot, especially if they're not in the coffee trade themselves, about some of the really kind of fundamental activities that happen to make it possible for coffee to get from, producers to roasters and from there on to consumers.
Thank you. It was great to be here.